Ibn Taymiyyah took a very strict stance on what he deemed orthodoxy and hence was very unsympathetic to any strand outside of his own. My simple question is, are we obliged to follow that level of strictness in our times? Salafis have an entire spectrum. You have those Salafis, I would say the bulk of them, that attempt to be apolitical. They don't want to even vote.
Dr Yasir Qadhi is one of the most notable public imams in the Western space, and he never shies away from speaking his mind. He has recently authored a book on Salafism, its history and thought. I met with Dr Yasir in Kuala Lumpur, and we sat down to discuss Salafism, the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Abdul Wahab, and how we should negotiate the deep divisions that have plagued our ummah for the past decades. Can we transcend our differences?
You spoke about intra-Muslim rivalry or sectarianism, and I think it was in the context of the horrific bombing of Tehran.
Literally, Israel is using the Sunni Shia card. Are we that foolish to not see that they're going to benefit?
Yeah.
We cannot be that naive to fall prey, and we need to come out to a post-sectarian Muslim world where we need to agree to disagree with civility without hatred. Stop finding an easy, tangible enemy within and realize the real enemy is the one that's bombing us.
We're at the Prophetic Strategy Summit here in Kuala Lumpur, and I'm here with Sheikh Yasir Qadhi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Sheikh Yasir, and welcome to the Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. The pleasure is mine.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us. And I think this is the first time we're meeting face to face for one of these podcasts. Alhamdulillah, we've met before and we've had a lot of conversations online, or a few conversations. But alhamdulillah, this is the first opportunity I've had to have you in our studio, alhamdulillah.
Indeed, it's the first studio, even though we've had 3 or 4 really fruitful podcasts online. But this is the first time we're actually doing it in person and all places, Malaysia, mashallah.
Malaysia, that's right.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. Now, I want to really focus in on your book. Alhamdulillah, you've written a really thorough academic book today on, you brought it in today on Salafism and the origins of this idea, of this philosophy, of this way of thinking, as well as some of the controversies, let's say, surrounding Salafism. And it's something that I'm interested in, really not because of the theological debates that exist within Salafism or between Muslims, but more sort of the political and the real world impacts of Salafism. But before we get to that, and maybe there is a connection with the first question, I want to raise a week or so back, 2 weeks back, you did a khutbah and you spoke about intra-Muslim rivalry or sectarianism. And I think it was in the context of the horrific bombing of Tehran and other places and sites and nuclear sites in Iran. And you very much spoke about how we need to get over these divisions that seem to challenge Muslims going forward. There was a lot of controversy, I think, from non-Muslims as well as from Muslims when you gave that khutbah. Just talk to that, please. Like, what is it that you were trying to achieve?
Excellent question. I began that khutbah by making a disclaimer, and that is that I'm not a geopolitical strategist. I'm not a political scientist. I don't do strategy. And I'm very, very cognizant of people staying in their lanes of expertise. So I'm trying my best to not venture beyond what I feel qualified to do. I believe I am qualified to talk about sectarianism and about how we should be viewing different Muslim movements and sects vis-a-vis other problems of the ummah. So in that spirit, I was talking. And obviously, you have to bring a little bit of history and geopolitics, but the focus really was, okay, we have these 2 massive trends. The largest 2 movements of the ummah are Sunnism and Shiism. And historically, there has always been an element of problem and animosity between these 2 strands. Let's be honest here. There's never really been a time in which 12 because Zaydism, you can actually make a case that is fairly neutral for most of Islamic history, and there's not that much animosity, and they just live and let live. The same cannot be said of 12 Shiism. And, if you want to go back hundreds of years, the Ottomans and the Safavids were at each other's throats, as you're well aware. And even before that, I mean, when the Buwayhis were in charge and the Abbasid Khalifa was very irked about what's happening. So there's multiple instances of unfortunately, rivalry and hatred that took place and manifested even in warfare. And the 70s and 80s are no different, in this regard. Now, my point in the khutbah was quite simple, and that is that, as Allah says in the Quran, let not the hatred of a group of people cause you to act unjustly. Act justly, that is the essence of piety. And I gave some basic theological claims, and that is that we have disagreements with this other strand of Islam, but by and large, the what I call the muhaqqiqeen, which means like the experts of Islamic theology from our side, consider this strand to be within Islam.
Right.
The same cannot be said the other way around, and that's another topic. But we don't deal with people the way they deal with us, even if they considered us to be outside the fold, or at least in classical times, because that is changing now.
Right.
We don't do a tit for tat. We look at the reality, and because they're Muslims, therefore the rights of Islam still apply to a level, even if we agree to disagree. And I'm not even calling for unity. I'm being very pragmatic. And in light of what is happening in Gaza, and in light of the fact that the people that are bombing Gaza are themselves attempting to divide and conquer, we cannot be that naive to fall prey. Literally, Israel is using the Sunni Shia card. Are we that foolish to not see that they're going to benefit? So I said that for the greater good, for the people of Gaza, for the reality of the situation, the real enemy are the people that are butchering children. The real enemy are the ones that are committing a genocide. And if they have attacked a 12-er country, nobody should be cheering. A'udhu billah. A'udhu billah. Nobody should be saying that this is good. And I understand certain segments of the Sunni community have had very painful political grievances. And maybe for them, they can sit aside and whatnot. I get that. But as a whole, our sympathies should be with innocent people around the world, including the women and children and the innocent men of Tehran that lost their lives for no reason at the hands of a tyrannical, genocidal, maniacal regime. I think that is a very simple statement to make. I didn't find it that controversial, and whoever wants to disagree, I mean, that's their prerogative to do so, but I stand by what I said, and I haven't changed, my mind hasn't changed in anything what I said in that sermon.
In a sense, you're making a political point there. Your argument, I agree,
is but it's coming from a theological background. As I said, I try to stay in my lane, but at times there's going to be a little bit of overlap. I can't help that. But my goal is not to, analyze the geopolitics of the region. I didn't go into, what is the long-term agenda. I didn't go into that. I'm simply saying, don't use the sectarian card and allow a common enemy to divide us even more. We have to agree to disagree civilly. That's what I'm asking for. And we have to unite against the common enemy. And then if we want to dialogue and, discuss afterwards, that's fine. But for the time being, there is a regional superpower that is an enemy to the entirety of the ummah. And we cannot fall prey to their machinations of divide and conquer.
Around the world, more than 250 million children are out of school due to poverty, displacement, and war. That's 250 million dreams deferred, 250 million futures at risk in places such as Afghanistan, Gaza, Ghana, Kenya, Somalia, Pakistan, and beyond. Students dream of attending school to better their futures and break the cycle of poverty. Baitulmaal is continuing to work in these countries to help change this reality. From opening schools in Gaza to supporting education programs for orphans in Ghana, Baitulmaal is helping children reclaim their right to learn. By sponsoring an education kit, you can help a child achieve their dreams. These kits include stationery, textbooks, uniforms, backpacks, and most importantly, hope for a better tomorrow. Turn your compassion into hope.
Is it fair to say, in relation to what I want to focus in on today, your book and your work and your academic study into Salafism, is it fair to say that in the last century at least, or maybe a century or two, the Sunni Shia divide has taken a different emphasis? You've said historically, Shias have had antipathy, I suppose, towards Sunnis, but there are lots of Sunnis today, especially those who subscribe to Salafism, who would outright say that Shias are kuffar, and even worse, actually, they would go even further by saying that we should ally against them, even with our enemies, right? So do you think that way of thinking comes from the type of theological strand you're addressing here in your book?
So one of the problems talking about these issues, one of my main goals and focus for the last decade has been to minimize sectarianism. We're never going to overcome it, but to be reasonable and to minimize at least hatred. The problem comes, one of the ways to do that is by talking about the various sects and movements. And the goal here is not to inflame sectarianism. The goal is we have to be academic and discuss, well, okay, what does Salafism say? What do the Ubandi say? What do other people say? And of course, because of my own association with the movement, obviously, I felt even more compelled to write a book. And I've always made the disclaimer, this is not a critique. This is not a bashing of the movement. It's actually a encyclopedic introduction. Quite almost all of it is just a historic description of the movement. So with that having been said, one of the aspects that Salafism has been known for, and that is, it is correct to point out, is that generally speaking, it has been a little bit more hostile towards 12ers than, let us say, many Sufi movements of the past, right? That is just a factually correct statement. Beginning with, the early scholars, Ibn Taymiyyah, who wrote an entire 10-volume work, Minhaj Sunnah, which is specifically meant to refute 12er theology. And he uses very, very harsh adjectives against them. However, as a default, Ibn Taymiyyah did not claim that 12ers were outside the fold of Islam, right? The same cannot be said of Ibn Abdul Wahab. Ibn Abdul Wahab, by and large, did seem to view them outside the fold. And in fact, he attacked Karbala and he massacred thousands of people in Karbala, believing them to be basically pagans outside the fold of Islam. And also, obviously, the movement, the followers of Ibn Abdul Wahab have obviously been even more hostile. Perhaps it is correct to state the most hostile in the modern Sunni framework than many other strands. That having been said, we don't base truth on personalities or movements, and we have to discuss concepts and theories. So on what basis do Sunnis consider this movement to be outside the fold of Islam? That's a theological discussion. I went over them. The reason why the followers of Ibn Abdul Wahab found it easier to do so is because of a theological peculiarity to them. And again, this is a theological discussion. I know you don't, but we have to do that because all Sunnis love the Sahaba. So all Sunni movements are very much in opposition to the 12er understanding of Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman radiallahu anhum. Most Sunnis did not consider that to be a level of kufr. If you consider Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhu to have not obeyed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, most Sunni scholars, in fact, I would say this is the default, that is not considered to be kufr. So the followers of Ibn Abdul Wahab are the same in this regard. What makes them different? There's a theological issue called invoking the dead. Istighatha bil amwat. In this particular issue, the followers of Ibn Abdul Wahab follow a unique position that no other mainstream strand follows, which is neither Deobandis, by the way, nor Sufis, nor of course some of the Sufis consider this to be a valid thing. Ibn Abdul Wahab said, if you invoke the dead, de facto that is shirk and kufr, that's it, end of story. And obviously, a part of Shia rituals is to call upon the imams, right? Most Sunnis would have one of two opinions. A, it is permissible with conditions because you're going through them to reach Allah. And B, it should be avoided because it's bordering on shirk. But as long as you don't view them to be gods, then you are not committing shirk.
Right.
Ibn Abdul Wahab didn't have these distinctions, and he basically said it is shirk. Because the 12ers typically do this, so it's easier for that strand to, as a default, say they're outside the fold of Islam. This is a theological issue, which is why when you battle sectarianism, unfortunately, you do have to go a little bit deeper and talk about these theological issues. Of course, I do have a longer video about why I disagree with that assessment. Invoking the dead is not something I like to do. But when a Muslim does it, you cannot equate a Muslim with the mindset of La ilaha illallah to a Hindu or a pagan who invokes, even to a Christian when they invoke Jesus. The perception that the Christian has of Jesus is nowhere near the perception that a Muslim has of the Prophet ﷺ when they might go to the grave and ask the Prophet for something.
So can I ask you about that? So what you seem to be evoking here is a view that Islam is a big tent, and Islam tries to incorporate as many interpretations that are as valid as possible. And even if one group does not find another interpretation valid, as long as there's an excuse that can be given to them from a textual perspective, then we accept them to be within the fold, even if we disagree with them, right? What are the parameters here? Like who stands outside of that tent?
Excellent question. Are there parameters? Of course there are.
Yeah.
And for me, the parameters are the kalima and the implications of the kalima. Now, everybody would say that. Ibn Abdul Wahab would say that as well. So the devil's in the detail, as the saying goes, right?
Yeah.
For me, to believe in another God besides Allah, pause here, this is the whole point. Ibn Abdul Wahab says, you don't need to believe in another God. You simply must venerate an object to a point that I think it is beyond the red line, in which case I'll say you believe in another God, even if you don't actually believe in a God. Right. That's the whole point here. I would say, no, there has to be an affirmation that I believe another entity is worthy of worship. Right. And Christians believe Jesus is worthy of worship. No Muslim believes the Prophet is worthy of worship. There's just no Muslim. I mean, there might be some ignorant person doesn't know any better, but no Muslim believes that the Prophet is independently powerful and worthy of worship. That's not what Islam is. So if you believe in another God besides Allah, or you believe in a prophet after the Prophet, and we know this by unanimous consensus of the companions. When Musaylima came along, there were no two opinions. And that is one of the corollaries of Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I would also add here, a part of the kalima, when you say there is no God that should be worshipped other than Allah, there must be worship that is done to that God, to Allah. So there are some strands, such as the Duruz, forget their theology, that's bad enough, they have no worship. They have no salah, they have no ibadah, they have no the Ramadan, they have no tilawah of the Quran. When there's no worship, how can there be any deen, right? So I would say the red lines are fairly clear, and that is to reject Allah as the sole deity, or to reject the finality of the Prophet and its implications. That is the big tent of Islam.
Yeah.
Within it, is everybody else the same? I never said that. I never said they're all the same. Yeah. Some are closer to the truth than others, and without a doubt, within all the strands, obviously, what I call generic Sunnism, which is the Quran and Sunnah and respect to the Sahaba. Yeah. This is something that I think you can derive it easily from the Quran. But I do make a claim, which is a bit contentious to some. Mainstream Sunnism in all of its forms, the differences between them are so trivial as to really not be anything that should be of a cultural issue. Let it be discussed in advanced seminaries. Let it be discussed behind closed doors. But once you've agreed that I want to worship Allah based upon the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we understand by this that the Sahaba are going to be the ones transmitting that sunnah, by and large, you're in the same room. If somebody has they believe in divine imams, they're in a different room, but still within the building of Islam. You get my point here, right? So I think that one of the explicit arguments that I'm continuously making, it is time for us to rethink through classical sectarianism. I don't have to categorize you based upon abstract notions of theology, okay?
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, when we talk about the hostility that sometimes exists between Muslims, Ibn Taymiyyah is almost always evoked as someone who injected some intolerance within Sunni Islam. I mean, is that a fair assessment of Ibn Taymiyyah? And tell me about Ibn Taymiyyah. I don't think I know enough about his life. Explain that briefly to us.
I would say intolerance is not the right word to use, although it could be interpreted as such. I would say every single strand of Islam, without exception, whether it is strands of Ash'arism, or strands of Mu'tazilism, or strands of Ithna Asharism, or strands of Proto-Sunnism, or Hanbalism, you find people that were so passionate about what they believed that they were extremely harsh on anybody who disagreed with them. This is not unique to Ibn Taymiyyah. There are many examples in the Ash'ari school of fanatics. There are many examples in 12er schools, in Sufi schools. When Imam al-Ghazali's books first reached Andalus, there weren't followers of Ibn Taymiyyah who burnt them at the stake. These were mainstream Malikis. They were not, Ibn Taymiyyah wasn't in real life, this is before Ibn Taymiyyah. As you should all be aware, the viewers should all be aware, when Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin reached Andalus, the preachers and the theologians said this is a heretical book.
Why?
And because they felt that it is preaching a version of tasawwuf and even kalam that they were not happy with. So actually they were closer to Hanbali theology, but that's not Ibn Taymiyyah, as I'm trying to say. They were not Taymiyyan. Ibn Taymiyyah wasn't even born.
Yeah.
So Imam al-Ghazali's books were banned in Andalus, and they were burnt in Andalus famously. By whom? Not by Ibn Taymiyyah, not by his followers, by people who had a different understanding of Sunnism, and they did not like, Ghazali understanding. Now, a little bit later, Ibn Tumart comes along. Ibn Tumart is a fanatical Asharite. He is a hardcore Asharite. And of course, he is the leader of the Muwahhidun, right? And he preaches Tawheed according to Ash'arism. And he says if your Tawheed is Taymiyyan version, i.e. call it the Athari version, you are a Mujassim and anthropomorphic. And he would persecute. It is even said he killed people. So when you quote Ibn Taymiyyah and say, oh, he was a fanatic or whatnot, historically speaking, I would say one finds harshness in all strands. Right. And I'm not somebody who's going to back project our sensibilities onto them. They had a different time, a different place. I'm somebody who's saying, however Ibn Taymiyyah or Al-Razi or Al-Ghazali or Ibn Tumart, however they treated their opponents, must we where are you from, Manchester or London? London, right?
London.
London. Must we in London, must I in Dallas import the hatred that they had of each other into our societies? That's the question I'm asking, right? I'm not concerned about justifying or exonerating or defending or critiquing Ibn Taymiyyah's harshness. It's a fact. He felt the Ash'aris were a deviant school, but he was in his personal life soft upon them. That's the irony. In his writing, he was a bit harsh, but one-on-one dealing with the human element, he was very soft, very kind. When his opponent who wanted to get him jailed died, he actually visited the widow, gave them help and said, I am here to help you in his loss. There's a humanity that is absent in his writings. And by the way, there's a whiff of this in the online world as well, that when the person becomes online, there you actually find Ibn Taymiyyah to be a very soft and gentle person one-on-one, but in the writings he was a little bit harsh. I would say you can find examples of much worse harshness in many other strands. But yes, I do agree with you that Ibn Taymiyyah took a very strict stance on what he deemed orthodoxy, and hence was very unsympathetic to any strand outside of his own. My simple question is, are we obliged to follow that level of strictness in our times? And I don't think we are.
What you described there of Islamic history, in a sense, sounds quite bleak. Are you saying that in the sort of the long durée of Islamic history, that the intolerance was stronger than the pluralism, or what is it, mostly a pluralistic, we were living through pluralistic eras and they were punctuated with periods of intolerance? Like, which way around was it when it comes to history?
No, I would say as a default, society tolerated pluralism, but there was always hostility at the intellectual level and rarely at the political level.
Okay,
One of the hallmarks of our civilization, in contrast to Christianity, we rarely went to war or even punished heretical views. It did happen once in a while, right? Hallaj was allegedly executed for certain views and whatnot. But if you wanted to count the number of people that were executed for heretical views, you can probably do so on the finger of one hand. I'm being a little bit more, but basically. In contrast to Christianity, which, as you're aware, its entire history is about battle after civil war, after heresy and whatnot. So I would say that by and large, the reality, the lived reality of the ummah was pluralistic, but you've always had pockets of people refuting one another, and once in a while, governments that endorse. So for example, the Mu'tazilites, as you know, instituted the Mihna. Ibn Tumart and the Muwahhidun were extremely fanatical, and they actually, the Safavids, they forced Twelverism. So again, this is an awkward topic, but this is factually, historically, what happened, that Sunnism was the dominant of Iran. Everybody knows this. Ghazali, Bukhari, all that they're coming from Iran. As we're aware, the Safavids quite literally forced a lot of it via persecution. It's an awkward topic of history, right? But that's the exception. The norm was the society allowed a level of pluralism. Frankly, allow me to say this even, the average person if he or she were to read Islamic history, they would be shocked at how open most of Islamic society was.
Explain that, yeah.
The prevalence of alcohol everywhere.
Right.
The prevalence of singing girls. And singing girls means there's an implication, right? The prevalence of alternative lifestyles. Again, that's something shocking to the average person. Everybody knows. People knew it was there, but it wasn't like in the streets.
Right.
It's there. Everybody knows what it is, but it's there. So the notion that many people have is that there was this idealistic utopia of the past, right? And that's because they haven't studied history. And that's because as well, some of our preachers paint the past in such romanticized terms. And of course, I'm against that, right? But yeah, so what humans are humans. Humans are humans. In every society, you're going to have these types of, evils. The point of Islamic society is we minimize its existence in the public sphere.
Right.
That's really the whole goal. And of course, you preach against its existence in the private, but we do not monitor the private spheres.
So on the subject of Ibn Taymiyyah, I mean, apart from the possible perceived intolerance, and alhamdulillah, you've placed it within a broader context, a historical context, there is a claim that he was a very controversial figure because he injected a form of literalism into Islamic fiqh, which historically, especially when we think about the four madahib, was absent. I mean, is that a fair observation of his theory?
I don't think so at all.
Right.
I believe the literalism, you can at least say maybe in the attributes, he was more inclined towards the literalist side.
Yeah.
But in terms of fiqh, if anything, he was one of the revivers. Right. In the sense, he's actually, in his time frame, there was quite a lot of hostility about breaking away from the madhabs. There was an ossification that you should follow one of the four schools. And Ibn Taymiyyah was actually one of the main, and there was a lot of animosity trying to accuse the other schools of being deviant. So we're talking about theological deviations and heresies. There were pockets of Islamic history where accusations of heresy were very common against other schools of law. These simplistic mantras that our modern Muslims say, oh, there are four orthodox schools of Sunni Islam. People need to understand, these are contested mantras. These are contested and constructed slogans, right? And we might just pass them around as if they're factually correct. Firstly, they're not, because even to this day, people don't agree with this. And secondly, in the past, that was not the case. There were plenty of times where the notion was, and as you're aware, there are even fatwas about not marrying between the schools of law, and there's fatwas about, angry fatwas about the prayer not being valid behind other people's madhabs, right? This is well known. That's not. So Ibn Taymiyyah comes along, far from being a literist in that regard. He actually writes one of his most useful books that serves as a template for Shah Waliullah. And that is, Ibn Taymiyyah writes, Raf'u al-Malam a'immat al-a'lam, raising the blame and criticism from the great scholars. And it is a defense of all four madhabs. Like all four have a reason why they said it. And they're all trying to reach the sunnah of the Prophet. Right. This was a unique book that is actually in defense of the four schools, right? And Shah Waliullah comes along and expands it in his Hujjatullah al-Baligha. And a lot of it is basically, again, trying to empathize. Why did the Shafi'i say what did they say? Why did the Hanafi say what they say? So I do not agree at all with this crass stereotype. Ibn Taymiyyah was a defender of a vibrancy of Islamic law. You could accuse him, yes, of being more of a literalist in the sifat, but he's not inventing it. He's going back to the earlier Hanbali tradition, as I explained in my book.
So I want to understand, I mean, again, the West tends to, especially post 9/11, they tend to use Salafism as a catch-all term to imply radicalism or fanaticism or fundamentalism. And Ibn Taymiyyah becomes a key figure in the conversation about Salafism and about jihadism, as we know, right? And often they paint Ibn Taymiyyah in a very sort of crude way. I mean, from what you're saying, this is a highly intelligent, literate man. He's writing lots of books and tackling subjects. Yes, he's got some intolerances and got some blind spots, but here's a person who's an academic in today's terminology. I mean, is that a fair?
I don't think anybody can deny that.
Really?
I believe so there are many trends of Islam. The Salafi trend, as I document in my book, from the pre-modernity up until modernity, it is, I think, factually correct to state that they were not blessed with any figure as intelligent and as erudite and as well read and as well articulated and as polymathic really in his entirety than Ibn Taymiyyah. I mean, just look at the sheer scope of his writings, right? He's talking about all the different groups. He writes one of the most academic refutations of medieval Christianity. He's read the works of the Christians, right? And he writes, you know, al-Jawab al-Sahih ala man baddala din al-Masih, a 9-volume or a 10-volume book about the correct response to those who changed the religion of Jesus. And this is a book that is way ahead of its time. He's understood the evolution of Christian theology. Look at how the title of the book, Those Who Changed the Religion of the Messiah. And he's one of the first of the Hanbali strand to have studied, understood Kalam and Falsafa, to have understood Ibn Arabi, to have understood Ibn Sina. And of course, he strongly disagrees. There's no sympathy, but he's refuting based upon a knowledge and awareness, not just simplicity. So as for the simplistic perception of Ibn Taymiyyah as being a jihadist, unfortunately, this is due to a quirk of history, which I go into also in the book, which is that a number of so Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, you know, passed away in the early 8th century. His thought lived for generations to come, for centuries to come, and it found iterations in various people. But as with all figures, when another person discovers them, there's always a reinterpretation, right? Nobody can be purely Ghazalian in our times. A lover of Ghazali, an admirer of Ghazali would take Ghazali and then become a modern Ghazali, right? And with their own. So Ibn Abdul Wahab comes along and believes that he is reviving Ibn Taymiyyah. But of course, in the process, he reinvents him as well. And a part of what he does is he brings a militancy that was absent by and large from Ibn Taymiyyah. I say by and large because there's one exception to that rule. Ibn Taymiyyah never fought against fellow Muslims. He fought against the Mongols, the grandson of Genghis Khan, right? Hulagu. Of course, the problem comes, we as mainstream Muslims don't blink twice. Of course, he fought against Hulagu. The problem comes, non-Muslims say, but Hulagu, claimed to be a Muslim. Or at least his, segments of his army claimed to be Muslim, right? So by the time, sorry, not Hulagu, sorry, I mean, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who attacked Damascus. Sorry, the name is, I'm jet lagged, by the way, for the record, so if I make a mistake, it's because of I just arrived a few hours ago. But the fact is that they claim to be nominally Muslim. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah gave the famous fatwa against the Mongols, which is well known, and he said, they are not Muslim even if they claim to be Muslim. This fatwa was never given to Sufis, even to Shia, to Ash'ari. It was given to the army of the Mongols simply because there was no salah or siyam or zakah. There was no Islam at all. So Ibn Taymiyyah said these are people claiming Islam for political purposes. And he gave his famous fatwa, even if they claim to be Muslim, they're not Muslim. And now that fatwa is not that controversial. Unfortunately, after the revival of Ibn Abdul Wahab and a number of iterations came along, in the 60s and 70s, movements in Egypt used that fatwa against fellow Egyptians and the government of Egypt. They found that fatwa and they interpreted it and they applied it in their context. And that it spawned off a series of jihadist movements, right? Resulting in the assassination of Anwar Sadat. That was one of those movements. That's basically a semi-admirer of Ibn Taymiyyah, right? Juhayman, who overtook the Kaaba as well, again, following from that strand as well. Al-Qaeda as well, ISIS as well. All of these different movements that are causally linked to one another, there is a tapping into a Taymiyyan thought.
Right.
I would argue that tapping in is reinterpreted to the point of it becoming completely unique to them. Nonetheless, from the outsider's perspective, they seem to be in the trajectory. You see what I'm saying? They're quoting Ibn Taymiyyah, and they are theologically from the Taymiyyan school when it comes to God's attributes, when it comes to Qadr. So they're coming from that school, hence the perception that Ibn Taymiyyah is a jihadist fanatic. In his life, he never, ever physically fought against fellow Muslims, nor did he ever give the declaration of takfir or whatnot. So I would say this is a reality that is more due to quirks of history than to actually Ibn Taymiyyah's thought.
But are they also making reference to Ibn Wahab,
Ibn
Abdul Wahab,
yeah,
who had a particular view towards, in particular, the Ottomans. And I mean, my understanding is that, you know, his view was that the Ottomans had committed kufr in many respects. I mean,
yes, so obviously I jumped over this to get to Qietest and ISIS. Obviously, where are these people getting this misinterpretation of Ibn Taymiyyah from? It is through Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab.
So he is the filter.
I would argue, of course, his followers would disagree. And this is one of the contentious issues with what I am saying and what they say. But I think history is very clear. I think there's really, to be factual, there should be no two opinions about this issue. This is an incontrovertible statement that Ibn Abdul Wahab and his immediate followers and his descendants and the first Saudi states viewed the Ottoman Empire to be a paganistic empire that is outside the fold of Islam as a default. This is something that is crystal clear, actually, in his own writings.
Really?
And in the writings and epistles of his own children and grandchildren, they write treatises in which they discuss the verdict, not of the Ottoman Empire, because that's a given, the verdict of those tribes that refused to fight with them against the Ottomans. Their verdict was they are kuffar because they have refused to fight against the kafir. This is like the chain takfir that happens here, right? So I think it is not controversial at all to say historically, but unfortunately, as the book demonstrates, and I've spoken about this in other interviews, there has been a reinterpretation and a sanitization of the image of the founder, which has caused the modern followers, by and large, to say, no, he was not a takfiri jihadi. To which I say, as I've said multiple times, actually it's good that they're reinterpreting, and it's good that they're reimagining, because we don't want them to follow the original teachings. And we'd much rather that they have a romanticized version. But factually speaking, ISIS is tapping into the original thought more than many of the biological descendants and the ministers and the teachers of that movement of our times.
Sheikh Yasir, until now we've talked about Salafism that may be intolerant, may have created groups like ISIS and you know, groups that have rightly or wrongly interpreted the works of Ibn Taymiyyah. But of course, we've also got a strand of Salafism that is pretty quietist, that obeys the rulers, even if the rulers commit all sorts of harm against the Muslim ummah, who accept the authoritarianism of these governments and states, and say, even if they, you know, steal your money and whip your back, we should accept their government and accept their rule, right? You had a scholar who went on TV and said, even if the ruler commits fornication in front of everyone, we should obey him, right? And praise him. Where does that strand come from then?
So one of the aspects of Salafism, and before I move there, I'd just like to state also for the record, obviously because the questions were always talking about these negative aspects, every movement has its positives. So I must point out,
that's true.
Salafism has a lot of positives, right? And we should always praise the good and try our best to minimize the evil.
Well, I was going to come to that. Maybe I should have come to that early, because actually so many of my friends are, I suppose, Salafi, right? At least they come from the Salafi school, and they're very good Muslims.
Yes, exactly. So let's be clear here. That's one of the problems talking about a movement or whatnot. We're not attempting to constantly bash whatnot. Salafis produce the most academic Muslims without a doubt. No strand of Islam competes with them when it comes to the average layperson of that movement is more aware of the classical sciences, more aware of the names of great scholars, more aware of the evidences of what they say. Salafism is essentially an academic discourse, right? It prioritizes classical traditions and books and emphasizes learning, rigorous learning. Now, you bring up the issue of quietism and pacifism, and I need to point out, Salafism is, of course, a very broad strand. And within the umbrella, there are many pockets. And the problem comes, you cannot even simply categorize, because as with all nuances, it's a spectrum. So you can have a Salafi who has quietism in some aspects and, you know, perhaps is guilty of other aspects or positive in other aspects. Every person combines all of these different, you know, aspects of the Salafi spectrum. If you want it to be simplistic, you could say, if you look at it merely from the lens of politics, let's ignore everything else, Salafis have an entire spectrum. you have those Salafis, I would say the bulk of them, that attempt to be apolitical. And I would say as a modern movement, this is the default.
Really?
This is the default. They don't want to even vote.
Yes.
They don't want to get involved in politics. They don't want to talk for or bad against the rulers. Just ignore them and get involved with your personal piety, your rituals, your dress code, your teaching and preaching. This is the bulk of Salafism. And because of this, by and large, one of the frustrating things we have is that Salafis are so apolitical that they're actually, not concerned about, change via politics, right? Which I personally believe is a mistake. I believe change should also be via politics. But that's, I would say, the bulk. A second category of Salafis is what you have explained, which is not just not quietist, but actually supporting the rulers. Yeah. This strand, I would say, can be divided into two. And in my book, I go into details in this. The first of them are those who do not make this the core of their identity and typically view it as being the lesser of two evils and not like a religious obligation.
Yeah.
And they would say opening the door for criticizing the ruler and calling for rebellion causes chaos in society. And I would say this is the position of the senior clergy that were associated with the governments in the Middle East, especially in the 90s. They didn't make this a key point of theology. They didn't constantly use Quran and Sunnah. It was rather, this is a part of our tradition and it's better for us to do so. And the emphasis is not on the ruler and obedience to the ruler. I would say this, we can find this from the great giants of the 90s, Sheikh bin Baz and Sheikh al-Albani even though he would be more apolitical, but still no rebellion. And Sheikh Taymiyyah, this is clearly their default. This is the second strand, this is the first strand within obedience. The second strand makes this a key point of doctrine, theology. Hence, if you go against it, you are a heretic in the eyes of God.
Yeah.
This strand has been given different names, whether they're called Jamis or Madkhalis. This was the strand that considered obedience to the ruler as a primary token of piety in the eyes of God. And this is the strand that has been given a little bit of impetus. But dare I say, don't assume that social media is representative of their quantity.
Right.
You understand, and I understand, that there are forces at play. By and large, this strand has always been minimal in the real world, right? So this is what we call the Jamis and Madkhalis. Then there's another strand. They were the politically active. And this is what's called the Sahwa movement, where in that strand, they didn't want to rebel against the ruler, but neither were they happy with the ruler. And they wanted reform from within. They wanted to change policies without changing the ruler by allowing the ruler to accept input from the people and the masses. Basically a type of shura or a democracy or something of this nature. Maybe they didn't even call it democracy, but they said at least representative of you're ruling over us, so listen to what we have to say, right? And then you have, of course, on the other opposite side, you have those who rebelled and said this is not a legitimate ruler and we have to fight against them. And one of the beginning strands that did this was Juhayman ibn Sayf al-Utaybi in 1979, when he rebelled against the king, said that the king is outside the fold of Islam, and took the Kaaba hostage in the name of Islam. He stopped the tawaf, and of course I've given lectures about this as well. So we've had the entire spectrum of Salafism. And we need to be careful to understand that these are not defining characteristics. One could quite as easily take this spectrum, copy and paste it onto Sufism, copy and paste it onto Deobandism, copy and paste it on other strands as well. Quietist, apolitical, supporting the rulers, but not as a point of faith, but policy, supporting the rulers as a point of faith, right? And you find the same spectrum in other strands as well.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. Now, earlier on, you talked about the potential Salafi critique of Muslim society centuries after, the revelation, and that is the ossification of fiqh and the ossification of into four schools of thought, and the sort of slightly let's call it partisanship when it comes to the schools of thinking. And so I'm a Hanafi and I'm not going to listen to the Shafi'i and whatever. Now, is there an argument from your perspective now that critique in some senses is probably quite true? The ossification of fiqh and the reduction of fiqh to 4 schools of thought and, you know, the closing of the doors of ijtihad. Maybe that's apocryphal, I don't know, but you know, the idea that you can't renew fiqh because all of the known questions have been answered by the imams of the 4 schools of thought. Is that a sensible criticism, regardless of where Salafism leads you, or at least some strands of Salafism lead you? Is that a sensible criticism?
Personally, I agree that it is a sensible criticism.
Yeah.
I don't believe that following one of the 4 schools of law is obligatory in the eyes of Allah. But I do believe that it is sensible and safer for the average layperson to stick to a recognized school. Simply because the average layperson does not have the requisite tools via which to navigate the controversy over fiqh. And the problem comes between theory and reality. There is a massive divide. Theory would say, why stick to one school? You should just take every issue and look at it in its, you know, in its manifestations, weigh the pros and cons. Realistically, what happens is you get a free-for-all, the market. The average lay user, in the end of the day, suppose I don't know anything about fiqh, and you ask me a question. If I log on to Google, if I ask 10 people, I will get 10 different answers. In most modern issues, I will get at least 3-4 answers. How will I judge? Realistically, since I do not have the tools, I will either A, follow appeal to authority, emotional, or B, follow my desires. Because of this lived reality, understandably, traditionalist-minded, madhab-based scholars say, look at the problem with do-it-yourself fiqh. Let us shut that door and require the average layperson to follow one of the 4 schools, because at least the 4 schools are tried and tested. At least the 4 schools have a history. They have an entire encyclopedic references. They have a systematically developed fiqh that is not going to lead them astray. And I sympathize with that. So I do say for the layperson, it is good for them that they should follow a recognized school. That having been said, to say that it is therefore impermissible for the qualified person to break away, I would say no. And I have many examples, and I mean, in other lectures I've given them. Ibn Taymiyyah's fatwa of the triple divorce. This is a simple example. All 4 schools have the triple divorce in them, right? That if a man says, for whatever reason, 3 times I divorce you, all 4 schools have agreed that permanently the woman becomes haram upon him. And Ibn Taymiyyah argued this goes against the Sharia. And you cannot break up marriages, the evidences are against it, and this and that. And Ibn Taymiyyah single-handedly says against the 4 schools, you are wrong. And in our modern times, how many men act foolishly, and they shouldn't act like this. And they just in their anger say, talaq, 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 right? And children's lives are, you know, messed up. Marriages of decades are broken apart. Yes, the man was foolish, but does the Sharia actually say triple divorce is the end? Just simply verbalizing in anger. You know, most madhab would say that. So I would argue when you act, and I have many other examples as well. I have a whole lecture and a long online article about, let's say, definition of a musafir. You want to be literalist, the 4 schools have a number, how much you travel. Ibn Taymiyyah is like, well, let's think about not just a number, because a number, you know, varies from time to place, okay? Other aspects as well. The 4 schools, by and large, say that, you know, for example, a wife who falls sick, she needs to pay for her own medication, or her father needs to pay for it, right? And I mean, we should, or for example, one modern issue is alimony. A man divorces his wife after 20 years for no reason. That's the key point. For no reason, there's no legitimate reason. Classical fiqh would basically say the mahar plus a nominal gift, whatever, right? Can we rethink through and say, hold on a sec. If she was a stay-at-home and she sacrificed for the kids, now that the man has wealth and just wants to discard and get another lady, that's his right to do that. But surely she also deserves dignity. Can we rethink through and say, hold on a sec, if certain conditions are met, should he not be liable for an alimony, right? Again, we keep on, you know, you're aware, 20, 30 years ago, massive controversy over the language of the khutbah. And to this day, one of the madhabs is adamant, no, the khutbah should be in the classical language. These are things that you keep on coming across over and over again. The clash between, well, the madhab says this, versus the lived reality. So I am somebody who says trained people should come together and see, in light of modern situation, what aspects of classical fiqh can be rethought in our times. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying the layperson, I'm not saying the non-trained person.
Do you believe that a mujtahid can arise today who creates his own school of thought?
I'm not a fan of a new school of thought. I'm not a fan because been there, done that. You can't reinvent the wheel. And those who happen to be active in preaching when there was a blank slate, they filled a lot of that slate up.
But theoretically?
Theoretically, it would be problematic because of one other issue, and that is, are they going to reinvent usul al-fiqh? That would be a problem because usul al-fiqh, already the Shafi'is have a different version than the Malikis, than the Hanafis. And by and large, they have kind of sort of codified. So if they were to reinvent an entire epistemology, that would really be a very interesting and also problematic. And also, who's going to follow? So if Dawood al-Zahiri and Ibn Hazm, the fifth school, hardly had any traction, and they are alive and preaching in classical and medieval Islam, do you really think, if, I'm just giving an example, if Jalal Saab comes along and says, I'm going to follow the Jalali fiqh, right? Who's going to follow Jalal? By the way,
it's got a good ring to it.
It does, yeah. Jalali and Jamali, yeah, it does have a ring. By the way, without mentioning names, there are thinkers in Arab world, in Pakistan, who essentially have done that. I don't like to mention names, but they've done that. And guess what? They have a following. But they don't call themselves a new school, but they are doing that. So nobody has, I can disagree, but what are you going to do in the end of the day? That's their prerogative to do that, and they have to answer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I am not a fan. What I am a fan of, and I've said this publicly, is committees of qualified scholars from the trained schools, using the hermeneutics and the epistemological paradigms that we agree upon. Rethink through only modern issues. There is no need to rethink through, salah and siyam, unless, okay, calculations, that's a new issue. Let's think about it. Okay, issues of 401k zakah, issues of organ transplant, issues of IVF, right? Issues of any other issues of this nature, of a modern nature. We should think beyond the four madhabs. I have no problem with this. Not because the four madhabs are deficient, but because the times have changed and the four madhabs are human. It's not a critique of the past. It's a realization that the past did the best they could given the circumstances they had, and those circumstances have changed. But I'm also a fan by this, by the way, of scholarly committees, not of individuals. I like 5, 10, 20 people coming together and having some, support from one another.
I think we talked about how this is not a criticism of Salafism, and there are some very good Muslims who are Salafis. Actually, some of the best Muslims I know, family people who've got very good lives, very rounded lives. They subscribe to,
I've been through the movement. It's very true.
That's true. And a lot of my friends are, but however, they would say the following. I want you to, give me a response to this. When you bring up, for example, of a Hanafi school says the following, of a Shafi'i school says the following, they would say, but Quran and Sunnah say something different. How would you address that?
Yes, so firstly, this is a strand of Salafism. This is a common misconception that all Salafis are like this. In the Western world, no doubt, this is the more predominant strand. And this goes back to a particular individual, Shaykh al-Albani, who had a particular understanding, of fiqh. However, Ibn Abdul Wahab was through and through Hanbali.
Right.
Ibn Baz was very Hanbali. Saudi Salafism is by and large Hanbalite in fiqh. So the Western Salafi strand is owing its origin and its thought and its influence more to the Jordanian scholar Shaykh al-Albani, and his version was what you are saying.
Right.
I would say that it sounds very appealing, but slogans do not betray realities. When you quote a Quran or a Sunnah, when you quote a hadith, and you apply it to your situation, whether you know it or not, you are using a set of hermeneutics. You are extrapolating from the text to your context. And in that extrapolation, right, you are making many assumptions. You are clearly utilizing a frame of hermeneutics that others would call usul al-fiqh. You don't even recognize that it is usul al-fiqh. So you assume the Quran is speaking to you directly, the hadith is speaking to you directly. That is your assumption. And that is simply not the case. So when you say the Quran and Sunnah says, in reality, you assume the Quran and Sunnah says. But the Quran and Sunnah is not speaking to your situation. For you to apply it to your situation is an assumption that you make. So the way that I phrase this, your understanding of the evidence is not the evidence. So if somebody challenges an evidence you present, they are not challenging the evidence. They're challenging your understanding of the evidence. And this is what many of the modern Salafis fail to realize. And of course, Al-Albani did this famously in his book, The Prophet's Prayer Described, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That book was a game changer. It spread the Salafi da'wah like nothing else. And it spread a version of the Salafi da'wah because the assumption was given that the Quran and Sunnah are all that you need, and the madhabs are in competition with the Quran and Sunnah. And the reality, once you study fiqh, all of the madhabs are actually, the goal of it is to interpret the Quran and Sunnah, right? There is no such thing as the Quran and Sunnah without interpretation.
Sheikh Yasir, can I ask you, I've come to the following conclusion, and I want you to tell me whether this conclusion is probably what you think and whether it's a sensible position to have. I think that there are different people with different inclinations, and they come to Islam because they've got different temperaments and inclinations. And there are some people who like Sufism and they come to Islam through Sufism. There are some people who like sort of the more reassurance of a literalist type of view, and maybe Salafism provides that for them. And there are different, so people come to Islam through different means. And in a sense, we have to sort of accept that human beings are different. And there is this broad church. In our best days, we have this pluralism. And it's not about really refuting, or we can do that at a theoretical, at an academic level, but it's about living with the fact that people are different and they come to Islam through, like the way I think about it is that some people, without the reassurance of Salafism or the sort of spirituality of Sufism, they may not be that close to Islam. And so, you know, it's good to have different ways into the faith. I mean, is that, how does that sound? So
actually, you are mirroring something very similar to what I said in a number of podcasts in the past.
Right.
And that is that I'm a firm believer that human psychology plays a role in which strand of Islam you follow.
Agreed.
Human psychology plays a role in which strand of Islam you follow.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, and in fact, this is going to sound a bit strange, but isn't it true, and I know this is so awkward to say, that every movement has a stereotypical caricature to it in terms of its follower, right? So, and that stereotypical caricature actually goes a lot back to a person's psyche and akhlaq.
Yeah.
Right? So people of a certain version of tasawwuf, you find them to be a certain way. People of, Salafism, you find them a certain way. Jamaat Islami a certain way. It's the way it is. And I would say a lot of it goes back to the way your brain is wired. Certain strands appeal to you more than others.
Yes.
I actually firmly believe this. And once you understand this reality, which is my understanding of it, then how can you be so harsh? May I even say, you find the kernels of this even in the time of the Sahaba and Tabi'un. Some of the Sahaba were more politically inclined. Others were more apolitical. Some of the Sahaba were more scholastic. Others were more ascetic. You find that entire spectrum, right? And those kernels are there. And those kernels eventually become, larger waves, and they become codified and they become strands. So it's not a coincidence then that, this is of course historically true. For example, they've done a number of surveys that what are called the Islamist movements, generally speaking, they are from the middle and upper class, educated. Generally, they're not from the uneducated or peasant, however you want to call them, right?
Yeah.
And generally, some of the strands of mysticism, some of the strands of more ritualistic whatnot, are found more in that category. These are demographics that transcend, this is just truth.
Yeah.
I would argue that's the reason that's the case is simply because certain understandings appeal to other people. So there are some people, they love to go into abstract aspects of theology and fiqh, but not Salafism appeals to them. There are others, they just like, aspects of mysticism. Some people love to be led. Others want to be challenged and lead. These are all aspects. So when you understand this, I become much more, like I said, I take a back step when it comes to these issues. And as long as, for me, as long as you're mainstream, and again, as I said, for me, mainstream is very large, but there's mainstream orthodoxy, and then there's basically the red lines of Islam. As long as you're even within the red lines of Islam, what are red lines that I think definitely we have to oppose? Violence. Any strand that is violent against others, we have to be violent against them as a state. Secondly, intellectual violence. Any strand that is constantly making takfir or tabdir, we have to at least make, not takfir, but we have to verbally say that's crossing the red line. Right? Otherwise, if they're preaching their version, and without mentioning names, there are preachers in Pakistan, in the Arabian world, I really think they are not in the fold of orthodoxy. But when you look at their followers are Muslim because of that preaching.
Yes.
And had it not been for that preaching, in all likelihood, they would not be Muslim. So I look at the broader picture. Rather than criticize ideas I disagree with about this person, for example, which I might do without mentioning names. Without mentioning names. I look at, well, there's actually a functionality and a purpose. I look at it as the last sieve before leaving Islam. That there are people that hardcore fundamentalism doesn't appeal to. A lot of them, they gravitate towards me because I'm not but then there are people even I'm too fundamentalist for. So then they go even further out, right? And then they meet other people along the way and they're like, oh, okay, I like this guy. And they find iman, spirituality with those people. And they are praying 5 times a day. They're reading Quran, they're fasting. What more do you want then? Okay, I agree, some bizarre views. I agree, reinterpretations. But in the end of the day, they're Muslim. So I don't constantly look at the negative. If I must, I try to correct generically. But there are certain things that have to be corrected. And as I said, of them is the fanatics and the sectarian preachers of all strands. To me, you have to refute them intellectually.
At the very beginning, we had a conversation about sort of pluralism versus a very sort of narrow partisan view about fiqh and about sort of Aqeedah issues. Of course, we do live in a world dominated by social media, and in particular, young people tend to come into Islam with these very ossified, very strong partisan views. And you made a point about Sunni Shiaism, but I suppose we can extend that to intra-Sunni Islam, let's say, or intra-Muslim debates. Like, what's your advice to, in particular, young people when it comes to some of these divisions that exist and have existed for centuries? How do we reconcile those? How do we debate those? And how do we move forward?
Yeah. This has been one of my main points of contention with all fundamentalist strands that emphasize their points of uniqueness vis-a-vis the other strands. Unfortunately, the average graduate of a seminary is taught a curriculum that goes back many centuries and is then let loose in the world. And when they are let loose in the world, preaching and teaching, all too often, the only thing they know how to teach is what they were taught in the seminaries of centuries old. But the modern university student is no longer concerned with the abstract issues that the seminary teaches from its books of 500 years ago. Right. And so when this preacher comes out and says the same language of his teachers, hey, beware of those who say God is like this or God is like that, inevitably it leads to soft or hard sectarianism, but sectarianism nonetheless. And this is unfortunately rampant across the Muslim world. This is where I am saying enough is enough, and we need to come out to a post-sectarian Muslim world where we need to agree to disagree with civility without hatred and genuinely understand the controversies of the past do not need to be transformed into political ruptures of today. All mainstream Sunnis, what unites them is far more than what divides them. And the classic issue, which I've spoken about quite a lot at length, which I actually specialized in my master's level, I loved theologically until I realized, its reality, is that the attributes of God. Now, this is an interesting question, interesting issue. Every single classical book of Islamic theology centers around the attributes of God. That is the defining characteristic of Islamic theology. Nobody, or very few people, pause to question why. Clearly, the Quran is not coming with the primary function of defining the nuances of the attributes of God.
Right.
Nobody can deny that. Clearly, the Prophet is not making this the core of his preaching. Actually, it's hardly found. Clearly, the companions themselves and the first generation didn't make this the core of their identity. Yet, every single school, 12er Shiism included, Zaydism, Ibadism, Salafism, Ash'arism, Maturidism, Mu'tazilism, at least 50% of theology textbooks, if not more or a little bit less, is about the attributes issue. And when I did my PhD and when I went further, this is when, in my own studies, this is when, as I said, I came across a number of realizations. Of them, our theology was constructed to answer the questions of its time. And it is a problem to assume that that constructed theology is divine. And it is also a problem to assume we must go back to that constructed theology to revive the ummah. Right. So one of my biggest projects, really, in fact, I would say this is my ultimate project in all that I'm doing, really, is the preservation of the religion of Islam, especially in the Western world and amongst the next generation, transcending the petty sectarian divides and the ossified traditions of the past, while remaining faithful to the tradition. That's a key caveat, because I am not a fan of what is called progressive Islam. I think that they've lost the plot. We respect the tradition, but we also humanize it. To me, that is the key, difference that between me and many others. The tradition should not be discarded unless there is a dire reason to do so. Otherwise, if it worked, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But if it is broke, or it's not doing its job, or it's causing sectarianism, there is absolutely no need for two British or American, or British and American, preachers to be having it out over the meaning of God's hand and God's rising and God's face online, or even in private, unless it's an academic, a discussion just for, personal sake or whatnot. There's no need to have animosity between two people. And I say bluntly, this is more a question of semantics and language than it is actual faith. And it is a problem to categorize another believer based upon the abstract understanding of God's attributes. Right. Somebody has to preach against this and say, you're wrong. I don't care if 10,000 scholars before me did it. Good for them, bad for them. I'm not judging them. Right here and now, we need to move beyond this. That's what I'm saying.
Sheikh Hassan, I mean, can I, I'm a lay person, I don't have an intimate knowledge of usul al-fiqh and of Sharia. I learn fiqh to be a practicing Muslims. I learn my fara'id and I try to understand Islam as much as I can. I'm not that interested in schools of Aqeedah and the debates between the schools of Aqeedah. And, sometimes I dabble in trying to understand those debates, and it's interesting, and it's a great conversation to have sometimes when you're having, as you know, in East London we have chicken and chips, and we have conversations with one another. So it's a great conversation to have, but I'm not really that invested in those Aqeedah debates. Is there a deficiency in my sort of appreciation of Islam? Because I just don't find that interesting.
30 years ago, I would have said, yes, there is a deficiency.
Right.
The old YQ would have said, you're missing out and your iman will never be strong.
Right.
And you must study one of these schools. And of course, I would have told you back then, you have to study my school. You can't study the other school.
Yeah.
Now I say, you are upon the fitrah. You are quintessentially, and without even recognizing it, preaching and teaching and embodying what Islam is.
Okay.
Islam did not come to confuse you about the meaning of Yadullah and Istawa ala al-Arsh and the abstract issues of theology. And this is why the grandmothers of the ummah have more iman than their grandchildren who are debating over the abstract issues of Aqeedah. Simple, raw iman that transcends these petty, arcane differences in the textbooks. You want to see iman? Look at the relationship you have with Allah in your heart, and then its manifestation in how you treat the creation of Allah. That is iman. That is the essence of iman. And you don't need to study any Aqeedah textbook. You love Allah and you want to worship Allah, and you're genuinely making your dhikr in your heart and on your tongue, you're praying, you're doing tahajjud, and you're treating the makhluk of Allah in a good manner, you've reached firdaus. And you don't have to categorize yourself as anything, right? And that's why, you know, one of my teachers in England famously said this, it went viral, he said, once upon a time, Aqeedah was used to fortify people's iman. Now he said this, is used to destroy people's iman, right? And at the time, it caused a huge controversy. But if you understand the context and you look at the reality, as I've said multiple times, as Gaza burns, right now, even today, I just logged on to Twitter, you know, God forbid, Allah forgive all of us for even doing that. You know, I try my best to avoid, but you know, once in a while, we log into even today, a British and an American da'i are having at it about, you know, the importance of sifat and God actually has the other one. It's just so petty and sad. And they really think they're doing something good. And they think this is what the ummah needs. And so they're fomenting hatred against a fellow Muslim who prays 5 times a day, fasts from Allah, believes in Allah, reading the Quran, making dua, inshallah, both praying tahajjud, and they're creating hatred over some arcane, abstract, intangible issue that is of no relevance. Why? Because of the tradition. So I'm sorry, but somebody has to say at some point in time, yes, the tradition has become ossified. Yes, there are aspects of the tradition that are problematic, and this is one of them. This is not a rejection of the tradition in toto. It is an ask to revive. It is an ask to, all I say, be who you are, but keep these debates to private rooms. Take all of these guys that are advanced students and hash it out amongst yourselves. Then when it comes for dhuhr, pray dhuhr together and eat your fish and chips or your chicken and chips together. Shake hands together and understand the ummah has bigger issues than the issues of the past. That's my point too. And frankly, I'm sorry to say, too few people are speaking like this. And to me, this is a no-brainer. This should be the norm. And I encourage all the preachers to be bold. Wallahi, I know most of them feel this way. Right. They come to me all the time. Most of them feel this way, but they're scared about the backlash. Let me tell you, there will be minimal backlash because, as you yourself just said, you want to hear this. You already are upon it. The only backlash will come from other fanatics, and it's time we just sideline them. You are causing division. You are causing hatred over issues that are of absolutely no relevance whatsoever. So I believe, inshallah, we are seeing now a wiser and more mature manifestation. And I think that time will show that these types of ideas will become the mainstream and the norm.
And maybe it is right to say, I mean, we just can't afford to have these debates when Gaza burns.
We just can't. We can't.
Yeah.
It's sad. And like I said, and it's not just over these issues. It's far more than this. That's why I've been a little bit more bold about my views about so many other issues like politics. We've had our issues about politics, Islam, all of these issues. We need to stop hating each other if we have different ways to revive the ummah.
Right.
You're not happy with my way? No problem. You go your way and I'll make dua for you and you make dua for me as well. Simple as that. Stop finding an easy, tangible enemy within and realize the real enemy is the one that's bombing Gaza. This really that, and the real enemy is the one that's wanting to ban our religion. The real enemy is the one that shut our masjid down. The real enemy is the one, he wants us to hate each other. This is the real enemy.
Yeah.
So this is my key point here, that sectarianism needs to be rethought in modernity.
Sheikh Yasir Qadhi, Jazakallah khair. I think that's really been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure is mine. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khair. Until next time, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkinmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.